Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This morning we're tackling policy in politics with two Mississippians who know a lot about both. It's a battle brewing over voting rights in Mississippi. Can Washington finally negotiate an infrastructure package? Can Americans still forge meaningful compromise in today's toxic political environment? Serious questions this morning, and our guest this morning may help with some of those answers. Joining us in studio now is former Congressman Gregg Harper, and the Republican from Jackson and Rankin County, served in Congress for 10 years representing Mississippi's 3rd District. Gregg Harper, welcome to Mississippi Insight again.
Thank you, Byron. Great to be with you again.
And joining us now is Dr. Nathan Shrader from the Department of Government and Politics at Millsaps College. He's director of the school's American Studies program and a frequent guest here on Mississippi Insight. Nathan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a bit again about, before we turn to national affairs, we have some key mayoral elections coming up Tuesday, June 8th, with particular races happening in Hattiesburg, Laurel, and Jackson. Nathan, talk to us a little bit about those races and what you see coming in those races.
Look, these races are critical, and in fact, I feel like a broken record sometimes. I'm always telling folks that these local and municipal races, no offense, Congressman, are oftentimes the most important ones they're going to vote in the course of this election cycle, because those are the things that are closest to them, closest to where they live, the closest level of government it is to them. And so these races are really fascinating, in part because even though we have a Republican-dominant state, a Republican-led state, in at least Jackson and Hattiesburg, you have races where you have a almost invisible Republican challenger in the Jackson race, and the incumbent mayor, who was once a Republican, Toby Barker, in Hattiesburg, running as an independent. And I think that sort of feeds into that old, to paraphrase the old adage from LaGuardia, there's not necessarily a Democratic or Republican way to pick up the trash or plow the snow. It's less about partisanship and ideology necessarily at that local level, as it is about trying to communicate to voters what it is you want to do and being visible in the community.
And Congressman, what do you see in these races too? As you mentioned, you got a former Republican and of course a Democrat here. What do you see when it comes to those issues? Does it really matter about party?
And Dr. Schrader's really right. The local issues, what's happened, what have you done, in my neighborhood, the infrastructure issues, the roads, potholes, those are the things that people are going to go by, and it's a perception of that. And all of these cities have major infrastructure challenges, aging water and sewer systems that they're not going to have the money on their own to pay for. So how that's perceived by the voters, and again, the voter turnout, the excitement of those voters for either the incumbent or the challenger is really critical to that race, all of those races.
And all three of those cities, you have the incumbents who are facing some challenges here, but
Sure.
But do you think the incumbents are really going to have much of a challenge when it comes at the end of the day?
Well, looking at especially Jackson and Hattiesburg, I think the conditions strongly favor the incumbents in both of those races from my perspective.
I would agree with that. I think the incumbent's going to have the advantage on these if they've overcome that need for the right perception of how they've been handling things this term.
And when we talk about the infrastructure, particularly like in the city of Jackson and even down in Hattiesburg, when it comes to the infrastructure, how do we deal with those issues that have been plaguing these cities for so long?
Well, there's certainly some federal money that's coming into the cities and the counties that certainly can help this year and into next year. But it's going to take more than that. The fact is, no municipality has the ability on their own to take care of a 100-year-old plus, water and sewer system. It's going to take some help and some innovation on behalf of those leaders.
Can cities, can they grow without the help of the state and federal government involved?
Well, certainly in Mississippi, we do have the tourism angle that helps in places like Laurel. Certainly Hattiesburg and Jackson, we have a great story to tell in Mississippi, so we'd like for people to come visit and they can leave some money as they leave our state.
Mm-hmm. And your thoughts?
Well, leadership doesn't exist in a vacuum in these cities because of the interdependence between the local, state, and federal pieces that all have to work together and fit together if you want to see growth and you want to see development. And so no matter who's elected in the Jackson municipal race, no matter where you're looking in Jackson or throughout the state of Mississippi on Tuesday, those leaders still have to be able to work with the federal leadership and the state leadership if they want to get anything done. If not, if they are going to dwell on some sort of contentious or political or partisan approach, there's going to be little to show for it, I think, no matter what their cities or towns look like and who lives there.
It appears we passed the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and from a public policy perspective, how do you grade state and federal leadership in their handling of the crisis, Congressman?
Well, certainly it's unfortunate right now that President Biden is blaming President Trump for the COVID-19 follow-up and those things that are there, even though you have to give a lot of credit to the Trump administration for expediting the way in which a vaccine came to be, shortening that by years. So there's a plus there. There's still a lot of uncertainty. Remember this, the vaccine is under an emergency use authorization. There's still some unknowns about that and how we're going to deal with that. We see, though, certainly it doesn't help if you have the President of the United States calling governors of states such as Texas and Mississippi Neanderthals or Neanderthal thinking when the results since that time are showing they made the right decisions. And I'm certainly pleased with the progress we're seeing in Mississippi. We still have to take it seriously, but we are learning better, I think, on how to treat it. And so I think we're ready to ditch the mask and go back to hanging out with our friends, and certainly in the classroom, getting back to a normal setting.
Dr. Schrader?
Well, I think my biggest issue right now, looking at the comparative numbers of vaccination rates across the country, is ours is just too low. And I'm looking around at what some other states are doing, because I think that we all end up doing better work on behalf of the public when we look at what's working and what's not working in other states. For example, Jim Justice, the governor of West Virginia yesterday, West Virginia started out full speed ahead on this. They were one of the best states in the nation for getting vaccines out early, then progress slowed. He announced that they're doing all kinds of a cash-based raffle. They're raffling off
guns,
firearms of some capacity as an incentive to get people vaccinated, because they decided they know what the people in their state like, what their interests are. We're going to try to generate a way to increase our numbers by playing to what people are interested in. And I think that we have a lot we can learn from that, maybe to increase Mississippi's numbers, because ours are just still too low right now.
Yeah, even Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, has that $1 million lottery that he's given out. Is that something that we should be doing here in Mississippi?
Well, I still think it's still early on the vaccine process. There are a lot of really well-meaning people that are just kind of taking a wait and see approach, because it is under an emergency use authorization. They want to see, okay, what are the studies going to see? What are we going to learn from those that have gotten the vaccine? Am I in a high-risk category? And there's a lot of education, and people have to be comfortable with getting that vaccine before those numbers are going to go up.
Mm-hmm. And so you think more Mississippians need to be incentivized, or why do you think we've had the fall off?
Well, I don't know if it's a fall off or it just hasn't been as big I mean, in most states, though, it wasn't just Mississippi. In most states, there was a time as soon as the vaccines were available, most of the people that wanted to get a vaccine got those pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And so since that time, our numbers certainly have dropped off, but I think that's consistent with other states as well from what we're seeing.
What do you think?
Yeah, we have a Millsaps Chisholm State of the State poll that's coming out in the next day or two, and one of the things that we looked into this time is what are some of the things that could convince the people who say they've not been vaccinated that they need to get vaccinated, that they should go do it. And we had 20% of those folks say there's absolutely nothing under any circumstances you could do to convince us to go get the vaccine. So we're gonna have to begin with, first of all, by figuring out who are they're not reachable, they're not gonna do this, there's no chance that we're gonna do this, and then try to figure out, well, who's still in the pool of folks who are likely to go with the right incentive. So it's not just figuring out what the incentive is, it's who could still be moved by those incentives. That's what I think we need to be looking at, to do this, work hard and smart in trying to get as many people vaccinated here as we can.
Let's focus on national affairs. Last week, the U.S. Senate blocked the establishment of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Our Senators Roger Wicker and Cindy Hyde-Smith both voted to reject such a commission. What are your thoughts on that vote and the attacks themselves, Congressman?
Look, this is something I understand why people voted, different ways on this particular issue. On January the 6th of 2017, I was one of the Electoral College tally clerks there for that. The only House Republican in that role, very historic. So what did I do on January the 6th, 2021? I was in the House gallery when the breach of the Capitol took place, so I saw it from a firsthand perspective there. It has been reviewed and studied so much already. It's important to know this. What happened is just inexcusable. It was, first of all, very predictable and very preventable. It shouldn't have ever been allowed to have happened, in my opinion. The Capitol is such a special place, Byron, as you know, and it's a place I've given thousands of people Capitol tours. You know, it tells a great story of our history. This can't be allowed to happen. But the FBI has conducted its own investigation, the Capitol Police have, the Inspector General's done 3 reports since January 6th, numerous House and Senate committees have done it. The concern about having a January 6th commission established by the House is it really going to be used to be forward-looking to make sure it doesn't happen again, or is it going to be used as a political tool? And initially it started out as a very heavily weighted Democratic entity, which was negotiated down finally to get to 5-5. Yeah. So the key here is how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? The House and the Senate are treating this issue a lot differently, in my opinion. But I think we can go forward and learn the things we need to do without the commission. But either way, we do need to be sure we know everything about it.
Thoughts on the commission?
We desperately need it. And I was very disappointed to think about what was the emotions going through everyone's minds. We watched on television or on the internet what was unfolding that day at the Capitol on January the 6th. And to think that there were any Senate Republicans, let alone the 2 from this state, who decided to play politics and pledge their allegiance to Donald Trump and the Trump movement instead of to the United States of America by doing what was the necessary and proper thing, which was to authorize this bipartisan. As the Congressman said, though, it didn't start out bipartisan, but the negotiations moved along to make sure that this was not going to be a partisan effort. This was going to have as much bipartisanship as possible, given the split in the House and the Senate, the close numbers between the Democrats and the Republicans, that this was an opportunity for Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans to take a stand independently of Donald Trump, and they showed that for the most part they're incapable of doing that. It's Donald Trump's party. They're expressing that they work for Donald Trump, not for the United States of America, and that's really unfortunate.
You agree with that?
Absolutely not. That is a stretch. I love Dr. Schrader. The students at Millsaps are fortunate to have him as a professor, but I'm willing to come in and help give a different perspective next fall to some of those students if Dr. Schrader wishes. But no, I mean, you can't sit here and say that our 2 United States senators work for Donald Trump, not the United States of America. The fact is, this was being used as a political tool to continue to attack Donald Trump. We've studied this a lot already, so there was no guarantee that this commission could wrap up its work. In fact, you'd have to say that to have a commission formed and complete its work before the midterms next year start, it's an impossibility. We have 6 or 7 months left in this year to do it. There's no way that you could do it. So, look, and you have to understand that, Senator Roger Wicker, Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith have done a tremendous job. But there have always been some political aspects, Byron. You look back at the 2017, when I was there as the Electoral College tally clerk, nobody seems to want to talk about the fact that Nancy Pelosi and many of the Democrats were trying to challenge the certification of Donald Trump. So this is not like a new thing that's happened. The problem is our United States Capitol is a special, special place, and the visuals of that are awful, and you can't defend what happened. But look at the other reports from the IG's office, FBI, Capitol Police, and I think we've learned what we need to learn. We can study it more for the purpose of doing just that, of making sure it doesn't happen again. But it's a stretch for many of the Democrats to be comparing what happened on January 6th of 2021 with what happened on 9/11. There's no comparison there, but we hear that rhetoric.
Well, look, I'd say there's a vast and significant difference between a number of Democrats casting a token vote against a potential certification several years ago, and the majority of the Senate Republican caucus and the majority of the House House Republican caucus actually voting to prevent a full-scale investigation of this on a bipartisan commission, because the difference was those Democratic members who were questioning the certification several years ago, even though I agree there was no reason to do that, that they did not attempt to orchestrate a armed, violent coup of our government as Donald Trump did. And so that's the difference. There's an immense difference between the two. I don't think that's like attempting to compare apples and bowling balls.
All right, let's move on to more. Okay,
we
go on all morning
we
talking
were
about
having
this.
a lot of fun there. But
You're right.
no, the only reason that it was just a few members of the Democratic Party in 2017 for Donald Trump is they couldn't find a United States senator to agree on certification. You have to have somebody from both. But to call it an armed insurrection, it was awful. It's indefensible what happened. But I don't remember guns being used by protesters that came into the Capitol. And certainly as bad as it was, it could have been so much worse had that happened. That's why we have to make sure that we have the resources for the Capitol Police, Sergeant at Arms, and outside agencies to make sure this never happens again, Byron. We're all in agreement on that point.
Yeah, but there were some tear gas handlers and other things other weapons that were brought inside the Capitol.
Right, but armed signifies, guns and knives in my opinion, and so I don't know that I saw a whole lot of evidence of that.
Well, they were armed insurrectionists operating at the behest of the President of the United States, who instructed them to do exactly what they did. That's why this needs to be investigated through a bipartisan commission that the Senate Republicans have shot
We could
down.
probably spend all morning talking about what happened on January
Absolutely.
6th. But let's move on to some more discussion. The legislation in Texas, Georgia, and elsewhere points to a tense national debate over election security and voting rights. Mississippi already limits voting ID. Should we expect movement on the matters in the next legislature? Doug Schrader?
Well, I expect there to be some movement towards more restrictive voting here in Mississippi, but the problem is we already have an awfully restrictive voting system here in Mississippi. I'd hate to see what they could do beyond what they've already done to be more restrictive. So, but I don't know. I'm expecting there to be some movement just because that seems to be the trend among some conservative legislators nationally. But look, we already lack early voting opportunities here. We already lack vote-by-mail opportunities here. We already have too few polling places in some counties that make it kind of inconvenient for people to attempt to vote, and they have to travel too far to do so. So I do expect to see some restrictive legislation introduced, but I'm not so sure that we can be more restrictive than we are now and still call ourselves a democratic process.
Congressman, do you think we're going to see any
I think
changes?
it's a stretch to say that Mississippi's voting is restrictive at this point in time. For instance, okay, maybe we don't have early voting where you can start voting a month out, 6 weeks out, but a lot of people don't make up their minds until that final time, and they would maybe not need to or want to cast that vote too early. We do have a really wide open absentee voting process. You can call the clerk's office and say, hey, I'm not going to be here, I'm going to be on vacation, I won't be in the county. They'll mail you a ballot. And we have a very good plan for those that are 65 and older, and that is, it's a no excuses absentee voting. You just say, I don't want to go to the polls and vote, send me the ballot. So I think it works well. Concern that you have across the country is the demonizing of certain states that are trying to modify what happened. A lot of what happened for voting was done as an emergency because of the coronavirus for the presidential election. Nobody's wanting to talk about Nevada. All we hear about is what, Georgia and Texas. Nevada is going to send permanent law instead of emergency. They've now passed a law that says you mail every registered voter a ballot to vote. The problem with that is they're going to have a ballot. They can still come in. We know that voter rolls don't get updated all the time, Byron. It's not done like it should be done. And it does create problems when you go into ballot harvesting issues and those things. Here's what I can certainly agree to, is every person that is legally allowed to vote, that wants to vote, should be able to vote. And that's the process that it needs to be done. It can be done locally in different ways. Even though I don't agree with what Nevada is doing, I think that's an opportunity for fraud. You don't want to wind up with nationalized, policies for everything. I think you trust the states to do what they need to do.
Let's move on. With the 2020 census data finally coming out, a new round of legislative restriction will get underway later this year. What would you expect on this front?
Well, for Mississippi's purposes, you're obviously going to have to do some adjustments, as we do every 10 years, based upon that census. There'll be some movements in those lines. My district, when I left, When I started, I had 28 counties, reduced to 24 with the 2012 elections. So there's going to be some movements because there's been growth, there's been a reduction in some places. So I'm hopeful. We went through the federal courts to get it done. If I could go back and roll the clock back, I would have worked harder to try to work something out with my colleagues. So, but I don't have that opportunity to do that. So I hope they can come up with terms that work, and we can. Obviously, you always want to try to reduce the number of split counties. Yeah. There are 4 split counties in Mississippi for those federal elections. For the congressional races, I had all 4. So you'd like to not have the split counties.
And your thoughts?
I agree completely. If there's a way that we can minimize or eliminate those split counties, it's a numbers game. Unfortunately, we don't know yet. I've just been looking at some of the census data that's out there for some of the counties. There are some substantial decreases in population in some places in Mississippi, but there are other counties that have seen a pretty sizable jump. I think what this is going to let us do, no matter what happens through the redistricting process, we're going to have to continue to have this conversation post redistricting about what it's going to take for Mississippi to start gaining population again, so we're not having this discussion. It feels like every cycle of the census of we've lost more people, how are we going to account for that in the map making? Let's instead figure out what's causing that brain drain and address it, and try to bring new people into Mississippi so we're not having this problem of fewer people, so we've got to move lines around again. I welcome the day where we have more people coming into Mississippi and we have that problem to deal with when we're drawing maps or legislative districts
adding a seat,
and hopefully adding a seat. Exactly.
And speaking of the brain drain, last weekend we touched on the issue of the brain drain, and one of the things we're saying is we're losing our youngest and brightest people to other states because of opportunities. What can the state do, and what should we be doing to address that so that we're not losing those because of education, because of health care, and because of jobs, where they're going to Texas and Tennessee and Georgia and other surrounding states? Well,
you want to certainly make this the cool state to be in for young people. You have many students that come to college that live in other states. We want them to stay here, and we want to give them that opportunity. There's so many special things about Mississippi and how we tell that story. It's the best cost of living in the country is in Mississippi. People can have great opportunities. We've just got to make sure we create those opportunities for them here, whether that's through creating that perception and that narrative that this is the best place to live. And people get along great in Mississippi.
But how do you get the jobs here? Because we're saying that, but we're losing the people. We're losing the young people to other places. So how do we get the jobs here? How do we get those? If I can go to Texas and make twice as much or $20,000 more, how do you get the young folks to say, hey, I'm going to stay in Mississippi if the jobs aren't here?
Well, if they can only make $20,000 a year more in Texas, they ought to stay here, because that's not going to be enough to offset the increase in the cost of living. So you do have to attract businesses, and you have to start up businesses that are going to do that. And you want the ones that are the type that people can, whether it's an engineering firm or medical, whatever we can do. We have some great opportunities here, and you want to, really complement those and work on those.
Your thoughts?
I think part of it is that the policies we have in place lead to this perception problem that causes us to hemorrhage residents and not attract enough people, businesses, and do enough in terms of retaining those college students, like the ones that I teach every year. That I hope some of them are just incredible, and I hope when they graduate they stay in Mississippi. That's what I try to encourage them to do, but I just know they look around and they don't always see the opportunity to do that. And a couple of those things that come to mind is we've got to eliminate the sales tax on groceries. That's one of the things that really, I think, kills us. We're one of the only 2 states in the country that applies a sales tax rate of the full rate on groceries. Also public service jobs. We have thousands of Mississippians that would make outstanding school teachers, but where we rank in terms of teacher pay, even though we have done some minimal incremental teacher pay increases, it's still too low. And look at law enforcement. About $36,000 a year annually is the average police officer salary in the state of Mississippi. That's about half the national average. So we have people that might want to go into public service through law enforcement. They look around and say they can do better for their families, unfortunately going somewhere else to do it. I'd like for the legislature and the governor and our state policymakers really get to work on trying to figure out how to close those gaps to try to make this a more enticing state for
Yeah,
people.
and I think that's a great point too, particularly on law enforcement. We see it at our crime lab and other things too, that they get trained here and then they can go to a border state and make more money. So I agree that that ought to be a priority, particularly on law enforcement, and continue to value certainly our teachers.
Do you think our lawmakers are looking at that, since they've seen we're one of 3 states that lost population in this last census? Are they taking that number and looking at it, and you think they're taking it serious and say, hey, we got to do something now?
I think
hope
absolutely they will look at that and see. And remember, almost everywhere has seen an increase in sales tax revenue over the last number of months. Things are much better than we envisioned that they would be. Let's put that money to good use. And one of the ways you do that to attract and retain is to make sure that your infrastructure is strong and in place. So I hope we'll have a focus on that to make the quality of life better. And Mississippians love each other. We may have our differences within our families or within our neighbors, but at the end of the day, there's no better place to live and raise a family than here.
And the other thing you're seeing too in other cities where young people are going is they want an urban environment. They like to live where they don't have to drive, so they have that development of everything's right around them. Townhomes, apartments, they can walk out and go shopping.
Hey, if they lived in D.C., they may not have driven in the last 5 years.
So does Mississippi need to establish that, or go to our bigger cities and help develop that kind of environment to attract young people where everything's just centered around?
Having a community where you can walk around or walk to a town center is always a special thing. I mean, we're not going to ever be the subway and mass transit state, but we've got great opportunities and things that it's just a comfortable quality of life, and so I think we've got those chances to make it really, really special.
And you are seeing, if you look around at some of the more recent development in the city of Jackson, where I live, and many of the viewers live, that there are some of the loft and condo style developments that are coming in that are trying to build on a walkable sort of environment. But also, I do think that quality of life piece is really important, and that's where we get to. If you take a look again at comparative, where's Mississippi compared to other states in the nation? Wages just aren't quite where they are in other places. Maybe cost of living is lower in some places in Mississippi, but that's not enough for people who are prospective Mississippians to take a look and say, we want to go here we want to go to A instead of B. The other thing is, I think we've got a no-brainer in expanding Medicaid. There are only 12 states in the country, and we're one of them that have not done that. And I think that is something that just looks horrible for those 12 states that refuses to acknowledge this is a serious impediment. The lack of medical care for, in our case, about 200,000 Mississippians, that's a serious impediment to having that quality of life that we want to be able to tell the outside world, outside of the borders of Mississippi, come here and we can do better.
U.S. strategic priorities have shifted dramatically in recent years between Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. What remains of our global policy, and are we on the right track in terms of peace and security? Congressman?
Byron, our number one issue and focus is not, but should be, communist China. China is the world's bully, and they're trying to obviously dominate the world. You see what they did to Hong Kong recently. And that's what they want to do to Taiwan, which is free and democratic across the strait. And you look at with their Belt and Road Initiative, how they pour money into other smaller countries who then can't pay back what they have, and China comes in and takes that over. So while we're worried about every little thing here, they are focused and they don't mean us well. So I consider what's happening in China and what's going on there with them on the world stage is our single greatest threat in the world right now.
And what about Russia? What's our thoughts on?
Well, Russia is always going to be a problem child, but they're not going to be on the level of what China is, and so that's my greatest concern that I have, and I hope will be our focus on national security issues. There are always going to be hot spots. We know that, but this is the one that is already affecting our life. If you look at all the products we buy, the lost manufacturing jobs that we have because everything's being made cheaper in China. And you have to ask, why is it being made cheaper in China, and so much more so, and the restrictions that they have on their people there.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, two important things. First of all, let's look at the presidential leadership piece of it. This is where I see the greatest difference between the previous administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. This is what I think is night and day, that things are considerably better now for the United States of America in terms of the image we project globally, the way that we're interacting and dealing with our alliances, and the way that we're embracing diplomacy instead of trying to do diplomacy by 124-character tweets. I think that has been one of the most significant improvements that I've seen in the country in the last several months since the new administration came in, is that we don't have this reckless sort of foreign policy and military policy is kind of dictated by the whims of whatever the president's thinking about tweeting at a given point in time. But with that said, the thing that keeps me up the most at night thinking about America and the world is what I think is the problematic policy I think we're seeing planned for Afghanistan. I think that is going to be, we're taking our eye off the ball in the Middle East, and I have a feeling that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, at least as it's planned now, is going to leave our allies and our friends who stood with us there in the lurch and create a more dangerous situation for them. That's where I'm hoping we can get some serious bipartisanship on the Hill to attempt to pull back the president's policy plans as far as Afghanistan goes and rethink what they want to do with that for the long term, because I think the proposal that's on the table for that September withdrawal is just a horrible idea. And I think it's going to cause more problems for the region, but for us moving forward.
And certainly Afghanistan's been a problem for every country that's put their boots in there, whether we go back to Russia's problems with them. I think it's going to continue to be a problem. And while I greatly respect Dr. Schrader, I'd have a hard time believing that we look better on the world stage today in the Biden administration when you look at what's going on. You know, Trump, while he had his own distinct personality, I think the world knew where he stood. We had a very peaceful time during the Middle East. We don't have that today. The crisis on the border was basically non-existent. It had been shut down. Last month in April alone, we had over 178,000 encounters with illegals coming across the border. Only 3,000 deportations. We've got 3.2 million backlog of cases that are there. And I like the fact that the president moved the embassy finally from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem after every president prior to him had said they would and did not. So I think the world was a safer place with Trump. I also like the price I was paying for a gallon of gas at the pump. You know what was going on. But I do believe that we've got a lot of challenges. I want President Biden to be successful. I think right now, though, he's been coming across as somewhat weak on the national stage, and I believe he can turn that around. But right now, I'm not satisfied with where we are.
Any final thoughts?
No, I would say that there's a vast difference if you look at the image that President Biden and the Biden administration projects for the United States, both domestically and abroad, versus the more bellicose, angry tone that the Trump administration produced. And I think that, at the end of the day, is the greatest difference so far, and I think it's in a very positive direction, that instead of our allies wondering, you know, what is the United States doing now? Instead of a president in the past administration who probably wouldn't find these places on a map, the current president of the United States has the leaders of those countries on speed dial because he's developed the relationships with them that are beneficial to the United States of America. And that's where I see the biggest difference between 6 months ago and now, at least for our country, as it goes for domestic and international politics.
All right.
Image is not reality. And so while we may think that the Biden image is a softer, gentler tone and perceived better, our enemies will take advantage of that if we're not careful.
All right, we're going to leave it at that.
All right.
We appreciate it.
Thank you, Byron.
Former Congressman Gregg Harper, Dr. Nathan Shrader, good to have you in studio.
Oh, I hope you'll invite us back.
Not on Zoom this time. So
Thank you. Yeah, this is great.
Appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having us.
All right, and we'll be right back. Big thanks to our guests this week, former Congressman Gregg Harper and Millsaps College's Nathan Shrader. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.